Hello and welcome to Runkle of the Bailey. My name is Ian Runkle. I'm a Canadian criminal defense and firearms lawyer. A lot of people have asked me to comment on a shooting that took place in Penhold, Alberta, and there is a lot to talk about on this one. Now, the news reports, just by way of background, have indicated that a homeowner and his family returned back from a brief vacation and they found that their house had been broken into. So the homeowner decided to have a look around the house, make sure everything's fine, and discovered the intruder, the person who'd broken in, was asleep inside. Now things get a little more unclear here. The intruder at some point manages to get a hold of a bat. It's not clear if the intruder brought that bat with him or found it in the house or what the story was, because of course a baseball bat is a fairly common thing to have in a house. So, but in any event, the intruder has a bat and attacks the homeowner with it. It's also unclear as to where the firearm comes in because the homeowner, depending on reports, either armed himself with a shotgun in order to go and look inside the house, or else in the course of being attacked with a bat somehow managed to arm himself with a shotgun. Again, the reports are very unclear. I've seen reports either way, so I can't say for certain what happened there. But in the course of this, this altercation, the homeowner is struck repeatedly with the bat, sustains stitches, sustains various other injuries, and the intruder is shot and killed. So that is sort of our background here. So there's some additional details. Apparently, this particular intruder had broken into this particular house. It's been alleged, I understand there's no conviction, but it was said that this particular intruder had broken into this particular house on previous occasions and was out on bail for that. So this is complicated because once I hear that, I start wondering about the relationship between these people, and I don't know what that is. It's not been clearly reported. Maybe this is some situation of a grudge. Maybe this is some situation of mental illness and a fixation. We just don't know. But regardless, there seems to have been some tension between this particular intruder and this particular family. All of which gets us to a bunch of really complicated questions. The first thing I'll also note is that the police did not initially charge the homeowner, and they have now come out with a statement saying that they don't plan to. They're not charging this homeowner with anything with respect to the death of this intruder. And I am not always on side with the police. Some of my videos criticize the police. Some of my videos are less critical. But I would like to say that the police, I think, did things exactly right here. This is something that should be commended and something that other police forces should maybe look at. Because regardless of what, at the initial stages, the police wouldn't have done a full investigation. And they, at that point, they don't necessarily know what's going on. They can see what it looks like. But of course, police have to do a little more investigation than just going, oh, well, that's what it looks like, and we're done here. They might need to look and see if there was some communication, because, for instance, if the intruder wasn't, hadn't broken in, but instead had been invited in, that raises a very different kind of situation, right? So the police have to do an investigation, but what they don't have to do is charge the homeowner right away. And I've seen a number of cases where the police have nevertheless decided that they want to lay charges first thing. That's not what they did here. What they did here is they said, we're going to do the investigation first, and we can always charge later. To me, that makes sense. You can always come back and charge somebody later. The statute of limitations on murder is never. You can proceed on charges with that so long as the person you're looking to charge is still alive. So there's no hurry. You can take a few days. And it's not always necessarily going to be appropriate to take a few days. There might be situations where it's real clear. But when we look at cases like Ian Thompson, or the other case I reported recently, and I forget the name if I in fact know it, where that woman was forced to use a knife in self-defense, but had clear indications of a self-defense sort of situation in that she had, fractures and punctured lung and all sorts of... One of the complaints I've frequently made is that police should hold off. And they held off here. So excellent work. I would love to see more police forces doing that. And I kind of suspect that one of the reasons why they did hold off is because this is Alberta, and Alberta tends to have more of a sort of respect for the fact that people might need to defend themselves, especially in a situation like this, than, say, Ontario, because a lot of the cases that I've seen that have kind of shocked me about the early laying of charges have been Ontario cases. So once again, I just want to say good work to the police on this one. I really appreciate that they ultimately decided not to, that they decided not to charge right away. And now the decision to not charge, of course, would have been made with, not charge at all, would have been made with more information. And it's pretty clear that the police, I think quite properly, think that they don't have a reasonable likelihood of conviction on this one. Because, come on, the intruder's got a bat and he's in the homeowner's own home. I don't see a whole lot of juries wanting to send somebody to jail for that, especially when he's got his family outside. There's risk to the rest of his family. Yeah. So one thing people have asked is about firearms storage, and I would love to be able to talk a lot about firearms storage here in terms of what's legit, what's not, but we don't have a whole lot of details as to what the storage was, because it might have been that this was an unsafe, and I say might have because I'm just entertaining a hypothetical here. I don't know at all what was going on. But it could have been that this shotgun was sort of loose in the house and the man, manages to grab this because of that and load it or whatever, or maybe it was already loaded. But I've also seen a lot of reports that suggest that maybe he armed himself with this before going in. So it could have been stored in any fashion at all, safely or unsafely, before he decides to arm himself in order to investigate his own house. And that doesn't seem unreasonable to me. I mean, who knows how long the police are from where he is. I mean, he's in rural Alberta, and, police response times are not necessarily great, especially when you say, hey, there's been a break and enter, and I don't know when it happened, and, the police are not necessarily going to make this top priority. The other thing is the police wouldn't go into there, into a house with an unknown, with who knows what's going on in there without being armed. So I don't see it as a problem that if this homeowner thought, what, there might be somebody dangerous in there, I need to protect myself, especially given what ultimately took place here. A lot of the commentary and criticism has focused on the bail system. People have said, listen, this guy was previously accused of breaking and entering at this same place. If he'd been denied bail, then none of this would have happened. Now, I'm not going to comment on the specifics of this particular case because I don't know. I don't know what was before the judge or the justice of the peace. And it's a lot easier to sort of quarterback after the fact than it is to deal with it at the time. Bail involves a bit of trying to predict the future. You're trying to evaluate if somebody has a substantial likelihood of committing some further offense. And that's a quote from the Supreme Court in Morales. They use that substantial likelihood test. So that's a very difficult thing for a judge or justice to deal with because they end up dealing with a lot of people. And of course, nobody can predict the future. You're making an estimate of what's going on. But in terms of the larger philosophical issues here, whenever I see some sort of showy news case, one of the things that always concerns me is not so much could this happen to me, because showy news cases are by definition kind of rare. They're unusual. The news doesn't report on the ordinary and commonplace. But I'm always more concerned about how is this going to potentially be used in order to restrict freedoms, in order to give the government more power, because that's always the direction of this sort of ratchet. People say something ought to be done, and that something is always more power for the government. You might be thinking, how does granting bail less often give the government more power? Keep in mind, you have a right to be presumed innocent until proven otherwise, and that's because the government can sometimes get things wrong, and sometimes they can launch prosecutions for reasons that should not be considerations. Sometimes they can launch prosecutions for political reasons or because they just, the police in an area just don't like somebody. People sometimes get charged because their neighbor or an ex has a grudge and is willing to lie about them. When we say that people should be held just based on an accusation and not some actual, not something more than that, if we're just saying that an accusation is enough, that gives the government tremendous power to incarcerate people. And that concerns me. I'm more worried of our government on a lot of occasions and, the abuse of authorities than I am of the abuse of individuals. And different people have different sort of thoughts on that. We're never going to get down to perfect safety in any area because getting to zero requires that the government be given way too much power, way too much control, and exercise it in a way that ends up to, in this example, they would be detaining a lot of people just on the possibility, if you're wanting to ensure that nobody on bail ever commits an offense, then you've got to detain a whole lot of people who should probably actually have been given bail. And I want to sort of raise the issue of some past situations that weren't like this case. I've already said that the RCMP officers are to be commended for the fact that they decided that they were going to hold off on charging until they'd completed an investigation. That is absolutely what should be done. Or at least absolutely what should be done in a case where you've got this sort of clear possibility of a self-defense case. Are we picking the wrong side on this one? But there have been past cases where that hasn't been what's happened. I mentioned previously the woman who had to defend herself against a very violent attack, and she ended up spending a long period in custody. I think it was several months before she got bail. I tend to think that she should not have spent a day in custody. And, when the Crown calls it one of the clearest self-defense cases, if we start restricting bail, maybe she doesn't get out until her trial. Maybe, other people who have had to defend themselves spend more time in custody because, we're concerned. So there is a real risk to calling for the justice system, to be harsher on everybody. I also find myself frequently reminding gun owners that, quite recently I talked about a case where the press release described it as a machine gun and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. I'll tell you, there's lots of people in the public who would think that if you've got, and it ultimately didn't turn out to be a machine gun, that was a communication error. But, there would have been lots of people saying, why is this guy getting released? I've heard situations where somebody has let their firearms license lapse, and it gets reported in the news as an unlicensed, somebody with no license and dozens of firearms and thousands of rounds of ammunition. And the public is like, why did this guy get bail? Well, because he should get bail. I mean, there's a lot of situations. So, and I recognize here, I'm a defense lawyer. I'll sort of lay that out on the table. But I'm always concerned about the possibility of over-incarceration. I've seen far too many people be the victim of an overly aggressive justice system to really think we just need to, start locking everybody up and throwing away the keys. As noted, not commenting specifically on this case because I don't know what was before the justice or judge or, whoever dealt with this. Depending on what was there, I might agree with the decision, I might disagree with it, but I don't know what evidence was actually before the court. This story also provides a good opportunity to talk about self-defense. Many Canadians would be surprised to learn that there are fairly broad provisions protecting the use of force in self-defense situations, including, in this case, lethal force. The police decided not to charge this homeowner, and that wouldn't be because they said, hey, we think you committed a murder or a manslaughter, but we approve, so off you go. No, they're going to say, listen, we think that your actions were protected by the self-defense provisions in Canadian law, and so we don't think we have a reasonable prospect of getting a conviction. We're done here. Now, a major part of that would be that the intruder was engaging in the use of force that I would consider to be either a lethal or life-changing threat. Doesn't take too many hits to the noggin with a baseball bat before you're either dead or permanently damaged in some fashion. So this is a high degree of force that the homeowner was facing. But lots of Canadians end up facing similar degrees of force sort of out and about. I've seen lots of situations where people were robbed at knife point, or even stabbed. And it doesn't take too many stab wounds before you're also dead or suffering from permanent disability as a result of that. Often Canadian law would allow for the use of more force than people are able to actually rely on, simply because of limitations on access to the means of exercising that force. An 80-year-old woman who's being stabbed to death would be legally entitled to shoot her assailant if she had the gun. But of course, she's not. So that provides sort of an advantage to the person who's not willing to follow those laws over the person who is willing to follow them. When I think about my own situation, if I came home and found somebody in my living room with a baseball bat and, they surprised me, I don't think I could get to any of my firearms before I was beaten to death. The likely outcome of that is I get beaten to death. Similarly, if somebody attacks me on the street with a baseball bat, the likely outcome is I get beaten to death, because I can't even have non-lethal defensive weapons for my own protection. Another thing that comes up here is just the effects of having to rely on lethal force for self-protection. The homeowner has noted that this is something that they're going to have to live with for the rest of their life, and they're not wrong. Most people who end up in a situation where they have to take a life find that it does have lifelong consequences. PTSD is a real thing, and there's some other consequences that I'll get to a little later. But the homeowner actually said he wished he'd had pepper spray so that he could have used a non-lethal means. I mean, the homeowner here wasn't spoiling to kill this guy. Quite the opposite. The homeowner wished he had other means. And so there's some other people who might be saying out there, well, he could have, just tried to win a fist fight. Sure, maybe he could have tried, but maybe he would have lost that fight. And then there's nothing standing between this guy and his kids who are outside. He doesn't have the luxury of losing this fight. He doesn't have, even just choosing to lay down and die isn't a real option here. Even if that's how he was feeling, even if this guy was, I would rather die personally than harm this guy. Well, his kids are outside. You don't necessarily have the luxury even of just taking the beating, because you don't know what this guy's going to do next. So all of this is, it's frustrating. It is, because ultimately this is a tragedy that's befallen this homeowner. It's also a tragedy that's befallen the intruder. I mean, I don't know what led up to this, but I'm sure everybody would have preferred a different outcome. I also just sort of caution people to think about this, because you get a lot of, sort of commentary, and I think it's mostly just sort of bravado of people saying, oh, I could shoot an intruder and sleep well at night. Could you really, though? Because there's a lot of really hard dudes out there who've had to take a life in some capacity and have really struggled to deal with it afterwards. So I always sort of caution people on that one as well. The best outcome is not necessarily the one where lethal force is used. The best way to win a fight is to not be in that fight. But this homeowner, it looks like, he wasn't given that choice, unfortunately. So that's just some random thoughts there. Now, I guess I'll close this out by discussing some of the other impacts, and these are ones that people may not necessarily think about of this kind of defensive use of force. And that is, there is no statute of limitations on a charge of manslaughter or murder. So potentially this homeowner who, and I say this homeowner, we don't know their name, and if I knew it, I wouldn't share it here. But potentially they could be charged next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. Any time they could be charged. So they need to always think about that. They need to consider that there is the risk that the police might decide later they might change their mind. They're never going to be free of that potential fear, that potential concern. The police have, on occasion, been known to run sting operations on people they suspect of something, but they don't think they can prove it against. So if I was this homeowner, I'd probably be doing some research right now into Mr. Big operations and being real suspicious or skeptical of any new friends who suddenly show up. and want to start involving him in their business and that kind of thing. Maybe I'll do a video on Mr. Big things. I got a big backlog of video ideas, but Mr. Big's, it's a particular policing technique that is, in my view, really ugly, and it's actually forbidden in the United States. Cops in the US are not allowed to do this one because it's considered to be too likely to result in injustices, but cops in Canada really enjoy it. But this homeowner might end up being the target of a Mr. Big operation in future. That's always a concern. That's something that will never go away. So this also makes me think a little bit on media interactions, because so far the indications are that this homeowner has given a number of interviews to different media organizations, and they've portrayed him fairly sympathetically so far. They've portrayed him, and I think quite properly, as a victim, as the aggrieved party here, as a hero to his family. And they've also said, hey, we're protecting this guy's privacy because he's done nothing wrong, so we're not releasing his name. But they have released the town he's in, the street he lives on, and pictures of his house. And with those bits of information and Google Maps, I could be at his door literally in hours. Just pop in my car, drive down there, and say hello. So they haven't really protected his privacy. I could find out who this guy is with trivial difficulty. I mean, this is super easy. You have to remember that even when the media is seeming to be your friend, they're not really looking out for you. They're looking out for a good story. Right now, that good story is hero homeowner defeats villainous intruder and virtue prevails because the police are not charging him. But think about, is it maybe a better story if there's a twist ending and suddenly, is the homeowner really virtuous? The police are now laying charges. So talking to the media is dangerous because they might prefer that story, and anything you tell the media, you might as well be telling the cops, because if it gets reported, the cops are certainly going to learn it as a result of that. So you have to be cautious here. This might be the time to break out the classic line of, in this trying time, we ask people to respect our privacy and we will not be giving any further interviews. Because right now, this homeowner has everything he wants and everything he needs in terms of outcomes from the judicial system, and changing that is not going to be to his benefit. So there's always some concerns there. And sometimes people have cases and, they ask me, should I be going to the media here? That's always a risky strategy. And so it's one you need to talk to with a lawyer. Even if you haven't been charged with anything, you should have a lawyer. And if you ever need to use force in self-defense and, somebody is dead, it doesn't matter if the police have said, hey, we're not charging you yet, or, whatever. You want a lawyer. And that lawyer, I'm hoping this guy's got a lawyer. It's not me, because if it was, I wouldn't be doing this video. But I'm really hoping this guy's got a good lawyer, somebody who's looking out for his interests here. And I'm just always a little concerned when I see this sort of thing, and the possibility that things could change for the guy. So I guess those are my thoughts here. I recognize some of them might be a little controversial here, but I tend to be a fairly liberty-minded guy. I think that the outcome here of the homeowner being able to defend himself is a good thing. I do recognize that it might have been better in this particular circumstance that this individual wasn't out, but I am really wary of overturning, our systems in, just to deal with one unique circumstance. That is a way that classically, that is a place where freedom goes to die. People say, isn't this shocking event, something that necessitates giving up a little bit of freedom? And once you give that up to the government, they never give it back. When they say something is temporary, it's never temporary. When they say, hey, we'll try this out, it's never a tryout. It's always a permanent thing. So don't give up freedoms easily just because something is shocking or horrifying, because you're not going to get them back. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you've liked this video, please like this video. Please share it with your friends. Please subscribe to see more content. I also have a link to my Patreon below. If you want to support me, that's one way you can do it. I want to thank my Patreon supporters at the $50 level: Jonathan Wheeler, Jason Elliott, Canada's National Firearms Association, Kyle Martin, Jean-Guy Toussaint, Ivo Nedev, the CCFR, and the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. At the $30 level, Sights and Arms Limited and Marc-Olivier Damour. And at the $20 level, Matt Ward, Mark Whittington, Dale Nesbitt, Cameron Johnson, and Andrew Elsich. I also want to thank my $10 supporters who will be in the crawl immediately following, and in fact, all of my supporters. Thank you for watching, and I hope this has armed you with knowledge. This is a real sad case. I mean, some people might say, hey, listen, Runkle, your answers don't get us to a perfect ending. But we live in the real world. There aren't a lot of real world perfect endings. Sometimes the best we can hope for is least sad or least bad. And yeah, I'm just really glad that that the homeowner prevailed in this situation, because it appears that he was, this is one of those clear cases where you've got sort of a clear hero in the right based on what's been reported. I mean, I don't know 100% what was going on. I wasn't there. But from the reports, this is just such a clear example of somebody being in the right and being pushed into a real difficult spot. So anyway, I guess that's it here. Let me know in the comments what you think. I suspect there's going to be a whole bunch of people disagreeing with me on at least part of this video, but let me know. I mean, you might change my mind. I've changed my mind on lots of things over the years, but anyway, thank you for watching. See you next time.